The United States spent more than $100 billion developing the F-35 before it entered full-rate production. China made quantum information science a national strategic priority and has poured billions of dollars into quantum research since the middle of the last decade. Those two facts are rarely discussed together. They should be. The F-35 is not expensive because it flies faster than previous fighters. It is not expensive because it carries more weapons. Its value rests on one central promise. It is extremely difficult to detect. Stealth is the economic and strategic foundation of the entire program. China's quantum research agenda has increasingly focused on technologies that could challenge that foundation. In 2016, researchers at the Chinese electronics company CETC announced what they described as a quantum radar prototype. The announcement attracted headlines around the world. It also attracted immediate skepticism from physicists and defense analysts, many of whom argued that the distances claimed by the researchers appeared physically unrealistic. That criticism was valid. But something more important happened afterward. China did not stop. The papers kept coming. The laboratories kept expanding. Universities kept graduating new specialists in quantum information science. The government kept increasing support for quantum technologies, from computing to secure communications to advanced sensing. Countries abandoned dead ends. China institutionalized this one. According to multiple studies tracking scientific publications, China now produces more research papers in several quantum technology fields than the United States. In 2023, analysts at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute found that China led the world in a majority of key technologies related to advanced sensing and quantum research. That does not prove China possesses an operational quantum radar. It proves something else. It proves Beijing considers the pursuit important enough to sustain for years, and sustained investment changes strategic calculations long before a technology reaches the battlefield. Stealth works because radar systems struggle to receive enough information from an aircraft to track it effectively. Quantum sensing seeks to improve the ability to detect extremely weak signals that conventional systems might miss. The engineering barriers remain enormous. Nobody serious argues otherwise. The challenge is that military history is full of technologies that looked impractical until they suddenly were not. The first radar systems appeared limited and unreliable. The first drones looked like curiosities. The first hypersonic weapons were treated by many analysts as distant possibilities. Now governments spend billions responding to all three, which means dismissing quantum radar because it is difficult today may be missing the actual issue. Military competition is not about what exists this year. It is about what one side is preparing for 10 years from now. And this is where the numbers begin to look uncomfortable. While Washington spent years arguing over production schedules, software upgrades, and sustainment costs for the F-35 program, China was simultaneously building the world's largest quantum research ecosystem. One country focused on maintaining an advantage. The other focused on changing the rules that created the advantage. Those are not the same strategic activities. One is optimization, the other is disruption. Even if quantum radar achieves only partial success, the consequences could be significant. If future sensors become better at detecting low observable aircraft, then every calculation behind stealth procurement changes. Aircraft designed around invisibility become more expensive to justify, and future weapons programs begin from a different set of assumptions. That possibility alone explains why China keeps investing, and it explains why the story is larger than a debate over whether a specific Chinese prototype works today. The real evidence is not the prototype. The evidence is the persistence. For more than a decade, Beijing has acted as though the age of unquestioned stealth superiority will eventually end. Washington's procurement debates suggest it still assumes that age has plenty of time left. That assumption did not emerge by accident. China's push into quantum technologies began long before Western headlines discovered the phrase quantum radar. In 2013, Beijing elevated quantum information science into its national development plans. By 2016, it had launched the world's first quantum communication satellite, known as MISSIS. By 2017, it had opened the National Laboratory for Quantum Information Sciences, a project reportedly carrying funding measured in billions of dollars. Those are not the actions of a country experimenting on the margins. They are the actions of a state building an ecosystem. The ecosystem matters because breakthrough technologies rarely emerge from a single laboratory or a single prototype. They emerge from sustained investment across universities, military institutions, state-owned enterprises, and industrial supply chains. China built all four. The China Electronics Technology Group Corporation, or CETC, became one of the central actors. This is not an ordinary company. It is one of China's major defense conglomerates, deeply integrated into military modernization programs. When researchers associated with CETC discussed quantum radar concepts, they were not publishing as isolated academics. They were operating inside a strategic system that had already decided quantum technologies deserved long-term support. That changes how you read the announcements. A prototype claim is one thing. An entire national ecosystem built around the underlying science is something else. The United States took a different path. Washington invested heavily in preserving stealth superiority. The F-22 and F-35 became symbols of an era in which the answer to advanced air defense systems was simple, become harder to see. That strategy worked. The problem with successful strategies is that they invite counter-strategies. No major power simply accepts permanent inferiority. China looked at American stealth aircraft and saw an economic challenge. Matching the United States fighter for fighter would require enormous resources and decades of experience. Building technologies that could reduce the value of those aircraft offered a cheaper route toward strategic balance. Military history is full of these calculations. The machine gun changed cavalry. Precision-guided munitions changed armored warfare. Cheap drones are now forcing countries to rethink air defenses that cost millions of dollars per interceptor. Technologies that undermine expensive military advantages have a habit of attracting investment. Quantum sensing fits that pattern, and this is where the paper trail becomes difficult to ignore. Chinese government documents repeatedly describe quantum technologies as areas in which the country intends to achieve world leadership. Research funding increased, publication output increased, patent activity increased, recruitment of scientists increased. Nobody keeps increasing investment in a field they believe has no strategic relevance. I think the more honest framing here is that China is buying options. An option in finance gives you the right to benefit if a future outcome occurs. China's quantum strategy looks remarkably similar. If quantum radar never becomes practical, Beijing still develops expertise in communications, computing, encryption, and advanced sensing. If some version of quantum detection becomes viable, the payoff could be enormous. That is a highly attractive risk calculation. The Pentagon's calculations looked different. For years, procurement discussions revolved around production rates, maintenance costs, software blocks, and engine upgrades, all important issues. But they are the kinds of discussions institutions have when they believe the underlying strategic model remains sound. Because if you genuinely fear that stealth may become less decisive over time, the conversation changes. Then the questions become much larger. How much should you invest in unmanned systems? How quickly should you diversify beyond traditional stealth platforms? How much money should move toward electronic warfare and standoff weapons? Those debates existed, but often at the margins. Meanwhile, China kept funding the technologies that could force those debates into the center. There is a certain irony here. The United States spent decades proving that military revolutions often come from changing assumptions rather than improving existing systems. Precision strike warfare in the 1990s did exactly that. Now another power appears to be applying the same logic to America's own advantages, and if Beijing succeeds even partially, the question will not be whether quantum radar replaced conventional radar. The question will be why so many people assumed the stealth era could continue indefinitely, while another country was spending years preparing for its eventual limits. The strongest counter-argument is straightforward. Quantum radar may never work in the form often described in headlines. Many physicists have argued exactly that. Quantum entanglement is fragile. Photons interact with the atmosphere. Signals weaken rapidly over long distances. Building a laboratory demonstration is one thing. Building a battlefield system that can reliably detect a stealth aircraft hundreds of kilometers away is something entirely different. That criticism deserves to be taken seriously. Some experts believe the distances claimed in early Chinese announcements were unrealistic by several orders of magnitude. Others argue that even if quantum sensing techniques improve, they may never produce the kind of revolutionary detection capability that popular articles imagine. If that argument is correct, then concerns about quantum radar are overblown. On the surface, that sounds persuasive. The problem is that it addresses the wrong question. The strategic issue was never whether China had already built a machine capable of effortlessly detecting every stealth aircraft in the sky. The strategic issue is why China believes the possibility is important enough to justify more than a decade of investment. Military competition is filled with technologies that looked improbable until incremental progress changed the equation. Hypersonic weapons were once described as engineering curiosities. Artificial intelligence in military applications was considered immature for years. Cheap commercial drones were not supposed to become decisive tools on modern battlefields. Then reality changed. The counter-argument also assumes something else that deserves scrutiny. It assumes stealth is either fully effective or suddenly obsolete. That is not how military technologies work. Radar improved over decades. Stealth improved over decades. Electronic warfare improved over decades. Every competition between detection and concealment becomes a moving contest in which small improvements can create major operational consequences. Even a modest increase in detection capability could force stealth aircraft to operate differently, fly different routes, rely on additional support assets, or launch weapons from greater distances. Those changes carry costs, and costs matter. The United States invested hundreds of billions of dollars in stealth platforms because reducing detection probabilities creates enormous military advantages. If those probabilities begin to change, even slightly, the economics begin to change with them. That is why the persistence of Chinese investment matters more than the success of any individual experiment. My read on this is that people hear the phrase quantum radar and immediately jump to science fiction. The Chinese government does not appear to be treating it as science fiction. It appears to be treating it as a research problem worth pursuing across multiple institutions for more than a decade. Countries rarely commit resources on that scale without expecting some strategic return. The other weakness in the counter-argument is historical. Major powers often miss the significance of emerging technologies because they evaluate them against current performance rather than future trajectories. Britain underestimated submarines. Several militaries underestimated aircraft carriers. Russia underestimated inexpensive drones before the war in Ukraine demonstrated how disruptive they could become. The pattern repeats. Established powers become attached to the assumptions that created their advantages. Challengers search for ways to break those assumptions. And this brings us back to the numbers that open this investigation. The United States spent more than $100 billion developing the F-35 because stealth is considered one of the defining military advantages of the modern era. China spent years building one of the world's largest quantum research ecosystems because it apparently believes the future of warfare may look different. Those facts can coexist. What should make people uncomfortable is that the two countries seem to be preparing for different futures. Washington often behaves as though stealth will remain the organizing principle of air power for decades. Beijing behaves as though the race to defeat stealth has already begun. One of those assumptions will eventually prove closer to reality, and by the time the answer becomes obvious, the investments that determine the outcome will already have been made. Military competition rarely ends because one side invents a perfect weapon. It changes because one side begins questioning assumptions that the other side still treats as permanent. That is the larger significance of China's quantum radar effort. The question is not whether a Chinese laboratory has already built a machine that can effortlessly track every F-35 or B-21 in the sky. There is no public evidence that such a system exists. The question is why Beijing believes the possibility is important enough to justify years of funding, institutional support, scientific recruitment, and national planning. The answer appears to be straightforward. China does not need a perfect quantum radar to benefit from this investment. It only needs progress. Every improvement in sensing technologies increases uncertainty around the long-term value of stealth. Every new detection method forces military planners to reconsider assumptions that once looked secure. Even partial success can alter procurement decisions, research priorities, and strategic planning. That alone makes the investment worthwhile. The United States built an extraordinary military advantage around stealth technology. It changed warfare in Iraq, Serbia, and beyond. For decades, the ability to enter heavily defended airspace with a reduced risk of detection separated the American military from every competitor. But advantages invite countermeasures. They always do. Armor produced anti-tank weapons, battleships produced submarines, aircraft carriers produced anti-ship missiles. Stealth has spent decades producing an international search for ways to see what is supposed to remain unseen. China's quantum research effort should be viewed through that lens. It is not evidence that stealth is dead. It is evidence that another major power is investing heavily in a future where stealth may no longer dominate to the same extent. And if that future arrives, even gradually, the consequences will reach far beyond one aircraft program. Air Force doctrine changes, procurement priorities change, alliance planning changes, defense budgets change. What I find harder to dismiss is the timing. China accelerated its quantum investments during the same period in which the United States became increasingly dependent on stealth platforms as the foundation of future air power. One country diversified its bets. The other doubled down on an existing advantage. That does not mean Washington made a mistake. It means the strategic risks are becoming more complicated. My own view is that the most important Chinese achievement may not end up being a deployable quantum radar system at all. It may be something quieter. By investing consistently and publicly in technologies aimed at defeating stealth, Beijing has already forced military planners around the world to ask a question they once avoided. What if stealth has an expiration date? Once that question enters planning rooms, strategy begins to change even before the technology proves itself. And that is why this story matters. The history of military competition is full of expensive systems that remained tactically impressive while their strategic assumptions slowly weakened underneath them. No aircraft becomes obsolete overnight. No military revolution arrives with a press release. The shift happens gradually. Research papers become laboratories. Laboratories become prototypes. Prototypes become capabilities. By the time the evidence is impossible to ignore, the investment decisions that mattered were made years earlier. So here is the prediction. Within the next decade, the United States and its allies will significantly increase spending on counter-detection technologies, electronic warfare, distributed systems, and next-generation sensing, because confidence in the long-term exclusivity of stealth will continue to erode, whether quantum radar fulfills its most ambitious promises or not. The debate over China's quantum radar was never really about one radar. It was about whether the age of unquestioned stealth superiority is beginning to close. Tell me where I'm wrong. Comments are open. Pinned comment. A lot of people will hear this and conclude that China already has a magic radar that makes stealth useless. That is not the argument. The argument is that Beijing has spent more than a decade preparing for a world in which stealth may become less decisive, and that preparation alone changes how future military competition should be understood. The sources and research papers are listed in the newsletter. Read them before you disagree.